Guys, we're gonna start in a minute, so if you can start taking chairs or sit down.
To Angular July. Thank you for braving the rain and stuff. And so let's get started. First off, we'd really like to thank RubyCon MD for hosting us with this beautiful space and the awesome food and beer. And we'll have Carlos to give a quick introduction of RubyCon.
Thanks, guys. Huge thanks to everyone for coming. Very excited to be hosting tonight. For those of you who are not familiar with RubyCon MD, we are a health IT venture. What we do is we connect primary care providers to specialists for remote consults. It's really hard to go see a doctor. 52% of the country can go see a specialist, and half of the referrals to specialists are unnecessary. We solve that by connecting your PCP to a specialist to get a remote opinion, and based on that, they can improve their care plan and diagnosis and treatment options. So it really has a big impact. We're, as I said, very excited to host this. We use Angular for front end. I think our team is going to talk more about that later. Done a lot of work going through the rewrites. We'll talk about the technology, but also the product implications. Yeah, if anybody's interested to learn more about the business, what we do, the people, having an impact while building cool stuff, please come find us and we'll share more details with you guys. Thank you.
Second, we'd love to thank Zen Digital for helping organize and stuff. And of course, we'd like to thank our fellow organizers. Without this, probably wouldn't be possible and probably also wouldn't be fun to organize either. Okay, and of course, if you want to help, definitely Slack us at Organize Angular. We have our Slack channel down there if you want to get connected. And of course, if you want to speak, please talk to one of the organizers, and we'll set you up with a date. And of course, check us out on our social media platforms. All of our talks are actually uploaded to AngularNYC, our YouTube channel by Roman, our videographer. And we also have a Twitter, an Instagram, and a Slack. And we also hope that you'll follow the code of conduct. And of course, if you feel uncomfortable, talk to one of the organizers and we will help you out. So for talks, first up, we'll have David Burke talking about practical forms with Ngrx-forms. And then we will have Christina Lee and Dave Miller, the VP of Product and Front-End Engineer in RubyCon, to talk about how Angular helps your team getting quality results in a fast-paced environment. And last, we'll have a lightning talk by Nehal about PWAs with Angular using service workers. And as you guys may know, we have an improv game happening right after the first talk. So it's actually going to be about Agile. So the premise is basically going to be, we're going to be selecting 3 random people from a hat of names that Brendan over there, please raise your hand, is holding. And so each of the people will come up here and flip through 6 slides and give a talk based on it. And in the end, we'll determine winners by, I guess, show of hands because we're low tech. And the winner will get a beverage of choice on us. And afterwards, we'll be heading to Westville Hudson, which is a bar/restaurant to get more food and more drinks. So first up, there's no ending slide. First up, David, Ngrx-forms.
Off to a good start. All right, I'm going to try rebooting my computer, and I'll just give the first part of the talk while that happens. So Ngrx-forms is a project that I'm using for a few things of mine. It's not actually mine. It's a GitHub project that I found. And the use case that I'm going to talk about is an open source password manager called Passit, which is built in Angular with a backend in Python and Django. So one problem that we often face is building forms is very boring and tedious, and we have a lot of choices, especially in Angular, about how to go about that. There's template-driven forms, reactive forms, there's connecting it to things like Ngrx or Redux. Let's get this back on. Oh, we're already mirroring. Great. OK. So why use Ngrx with forms? So usually your forms are going to start out pretty simple. Maybe you have a login or a register form, and that's a pretty simple use case. You can just kind of get by with template-driven forms. But then sometimes they get complex, and template-driven forms start to not be the best use case for that. And you start thinking, oh, should I do reactive forms? Should I keep my state in the component, or a few components, or a service? Oh, maybe I should use Redux or Ngrx to keep the state in. So because of that, we can end up with inconsistent styles. Maybe login form uses template-driven, while a more complicated form with lots of different parts uses something else. Another use case that I have is I like to share my logic between web and my app. If I start out really simple and maybe just use the DOM for validation, like put an input tag, set to type email, that gets me some really, really basic validation, but then that doesn't correspond to an app. Also, there was a talk at another AngularNYC meetup on using Ngrx plus forms. So if you want to learn more about why you should use Ngrx with forms and sort of like more of the theory of that, check out that talk. But I'm going to talk more about a specific library. So here's my use case. This is Passit register page version 1. And you can see it starts off pretty easy. Just email, password, confirm. I'm going to show you version 2. And it gets a lot more complex. Unfortunately, we have the designer get involved, and suddenly something simple gets really complex. So you can see we have different, it's sort of like a wizard. You almost start with this. It validates on the fly. I can go, I can put in something silly, and it doesn't work. And we have all these different steps. Next, next, next. We're going to do a verify email address here. Suddenly, what seemed like it would be simple and always stays simple, right? It's just a register form. Suddenly, it's complex. And Redux is really great at this kind of thing, right? We can keep track of what step we're on. We can keep track of validation. If the user wants to go back to a previous step, that just dispatches an action, and we can get back there. So it's a really great use case for NGRX. But because I started this out as a template-driven form, I basically had to rewrite it. And so that kind of led me on this path of, like, is there an easy, simple way to write forms that's going to work both for simple login forms that never get complex? And here's the login. As you can see, remained very simple. And then keep using that for my other forms. So there comes Ngrx-forms, which is described by the author as proper integration of forms in Angular applications using Ngrx. So effectively, it lets you define what forms are and use a directive to hook forms into your state very quickly without having to go through a lot of boilerplate of defining all your reducers very, very explicitly. And that's kind of the general flows where we'd have a component, maybe it's an input, and it's kind of syncing back and forth with our state. So it's dispatching an action when you type something, and that reducer is maybe setting some things like validation. Perhaps it's detecting your email as valid or invalid. So why use a library at all, right? Because you can just do this yourself. You don't have to use something like Ngrx-forms. So my reasons are it stops decision fatigue. Of course, this is a decision itself, but once you make that call, then you really don't have to have a conversation of template versus Ngrx-driven every time you make a form. And you don't have to worry about those more simplistic forms feeling like a lot of boilerplate, because it's actually not much boilerplate with Ngrx-forms. There's also upstream documentation and examples, and I love that. Whenever we get a new developer, I can say, hey, this is how we do forms. Here's a link to GitHub. Go read, and now you're going to understand everything, and you're going to get a community of people updating that documentation instead of an internal team trying to do that and perhaps getting some inconsistency or missing a few details. Reducing boilerplate, and then just not creating a new architecture to solve a very common problem. Forms are really basic. We've been creating forms since like the 90s with AOL and things like that. We really don't need to invent them every time we start a new project. Ngrx-forms also has a lot of drop-in actions and directives and reducer functions to get going very quickly, but it's very easy to customize because they're really just pure functions. So you can import some functions and run that through your reducer to get sort of very common default things to happen, like validation. But if you do feel like you need to break out of that and customize it even further, kind of like in my registration page when I started out simple and got complex, it's very easy to do because they're just pure functions. There's input and output, and you can modify that and not use some of the shortcuts that they give you. It also has native script integration, which I'll talk about that in a little bit. So how to get started with Ngrx-forms. Basically, you're going to define your form state, and you're going to start just giving it a unique form ID. That's just a string that is going to uniquely identify that form as compared to others. You're going to define an interface. So if this is a registration form, maybe my interface contains email, password, password confirm, show confirm, and a few things like that. You're probably pretty used to doing that kind of thing already if you're working with a form. You're going to set your initial state, again, a very normal thing to do. But now you're going to use this create form group state function, which you can see here we're actually passing the form ID and some of our initials to that function. And what that is going to do is it's going to take your very basic form with just your values, and it's going to add a lot of state to it, such as is submitted, different validation states, is pristine. Probably a lot of words you might have seen in other validation libraries. You're going to see those same terms used here, but instead of having to define them in your Ngrx reducer manually, it's actually going to add all that stuff for you. Next, we're going to define our actual reducer. And this is a pretty long function, but it's actually all validation. We're going to use create form group reducer with update. That's kind of a shortcut function. You don't have to use this. You could just define a reducer. You could look at your action, look at your existing state, and just copy that state and modify it as needed if you want. But this shortcut, if you define this without any of this extra stuff, is going to just create all of it for you in one line. And this extra stuff are options that you can pass. All of this is just validation logic, and that also comes with the library. So again, it's kind of shortcut things for very common use cases. That's going to include validate, some like required validation. There's a regex you can see. We're going to make sure that the password and password confirm, that's just where you're confirming your password by typing it again, that those are the same. And if not, we're going to raise a validation error. And then there's a few boring things that you're probably very used to if you've ever really passed state anywhere in an Angular app, but especially if you're using Ngrx. So all we're going to do is write a selector to get our form. Very basic thing if you're using Ngrx already. We're going to pass that from a smart container to a presentational component and define that that's actually not a registration form, but it's a form group state with a registration form. Because again, we have all that extra metadata about it. Then we're going to use a directive. And that directive right here, Ngrx-form control set, is going to be set to the control for that particular form. So if our registration interface has an email field, we're going to do controls.email. And what that's going to do is sync that input with our state. So instead of having to dispatch actions ourselves, write all those actions, write the reducer to manage all that, this is actually going to just do all that for you. And of course, since you're using Angular, you're going to import the library into your module. So let's see what this does. This is now our form, our registration form that has Redux dev tools shown, and you can see some of the actions that happen. So as the user is typing HELLO, we're going to get a set value each time that they do that, which is updating our state, and we'll get some diffs from that that we can see. We'll also notice a few extra things are happening. The first time somebody clicks into that, it might set is pristine to true or to false as soon as somebody types something in. If they hit enter, it's going to set is submitted to true instead of false. And you can see a few there. There's mark as touch, just different things that you're probably going to pass on to like a CSS developer so that they can target those kinds of classes and make this red show up when it's invalid or green show up when they type something that is valid. A few more features that it has. Asynchronous validation. So let's say we're on, I'll actually just show you a use case for that. Let's say I'm registering, and I want it to do something as I type. That's actually checking if that username is available kind of 300 milliseconds after I stop typing. Similar to that, yeah. All it has is kind of like a default set of actions and a default set of places in your state so that it's very predictable where those asynchronous validation errors are going to occur. It's not writing that logic to like debounce for you. Obviously, it's not writing the server for you. You still have to have some endpoint that can do this check. You still have to write maybe an effect to know which server to ping and what is success and failure. But it provides some good defaults for you so that you know where those validation errors are going to live in your state. There's a lot of other shortcuts that I didn't mention, but different validators and things of that nature that you can just throw in your reducers for very common use cases. Different actions. If you want to dispatch actions programmatically instead of just when somebody's typing, you can just call those and import them right from the library instead of defining them yourselves. And then they create this concept of a view adapter. And what that is a Angular directive that is going to control the state of some component and sync that to your state store, and you can create your own. So for example, this is one I created for NativeScript, and that's how we can support NativeScript with Ngrx-forms. So effectively, I'm just defining when I put a text input into my NativeScript app, which is not a DOM thing, I can define, okay, when it changes, do this. And a few other hooks for similar things. So now I can take an entirely new system that has no DOM and also make it sync to my state. And it's a little bit of work to do once, but now I can just reuse those or publish them for other people to use, and we can get our native script apps built really quick and do the same thing we're used to doing on a DOM. And there's my example, so you can see some of the benefits of sharing the code here. Because I'm doing that validation in JavaScript and not separately in web and on the app, those errors are exactly the same. And if you look at the templates that generate both of those, even though one is the DOM and one is XML for native script, they actually look really, really similar. So that's it. If you have any questions, this is the library that I'm referencing by Mr. Wolf Z. And then the password manager is called Passit. It's on passit.io if you want to look that up. And the code is on GitLab if you want to see some of the examples that I just spoke about, or if you want to look at that effects code that we mentioned about how to do that debounce kind of logic with NGR effects. You're welcome to take a look. So. Any questions?
We have time for 2 questions.
Yeah, on the forms, I was wondering if you have multiple forms and you haven't submitted any data to the actual server, if the DOM reloads, how would we maintain the state? Is that something that you have noticed?
So that is something that I actually have done. If you're talking about like if you reload the entire tab.
Yes, you have step 1, step 2, step 3.
Mm-hmm.
The user finished step 2, and now it happened that the page is reloaded
Yeah.
and we lost the DOM.
So Ngrx-forms doesn't deal with that directly, but because you're putting it in Ngrx, it's actually extremely easy to sync that with local storage. There's another library, I think it's just called Ngrx local storage, that can let you define which keys in your state you want to sync. So you could selectively say, hey, this form, that's maybe like a pretty long form, I want to sync that to local storage. So they could even close the browser and come back to it, and you can control how it loads that state back in and get them right where they left off.
Yeah, you mentioned that for your sign-up form, you started with a template-driven form before you transitioned over. Would it have been any easier if you started with a reactive form before transitioning?
The basic answer is yes. If I would have used a reactive form just to begin with, and perhaps even sync that with Ngrx manually, I think that would have definitely prevented me from having to recreate it outright. But I think using Ngrx-forms makes it easy enough that I'm actually willing to do that all the time, because writing all those actions for every little form, especially if it's like one input and it has a submit button, it just doesn't feel like you need all that complexity. But Ngrx-forms is going to like give you that level of power, but without a whole lot of work. Right?
Boilerplate reducer?
Yes, exactly.
Cool. Any additional questions? You can definitely find David walking around here and stuff. So yeah, now we will break for the game and the
So the next thing we're going to do is play a game called Improv Talks. So this is a little game to encourage creativity and agile thinking and not taking ourselves too seriously and having fun. So there are 3 sets of slides here. We have some volunteers who have agreed to put their name in this hat. I'm talk with one of these sets of slides. We're going to have 3 volunteers in total. And they're just generic corporate slides. You can weave them into whatever ridiculous story you want. So, without further ado, I'm going to get my timer ready for 2 minutes. Our next speaker is Ahmed Gol. Welcome.
Is this supposed to be like philosophical, or can you
It's whatever you want.
Whatever I want, pretty much improv. All right, now I got to pretend like I prepared this. As you guys can see on the board, what bug? This is a question that has confounded software developers for quite some decades now. You either see nothing, hear nothing, or say nothing. As you can see, the monkeys depicted. From this slide, what do I have, 30 seconds now?
Yeah, there's more slides too.
All right, let me advance.
There's 6 slides.
These are terrible. So this is always a question managers, product owners, they always want to know. Who caused this bug? This just leaves businesses frustrated. We do all this work, we do all this planning, we put our unit tests in place, we do our integration testing, but at the end of the day, what the hell happened? Why are things not working? This is things that confound users day in, day out. So obviously the starting point that we're using, our planning stages, we're obviously not doing things correctly. We need to get back to the basics, get back to the drawing board, try to outline things that weren't there, things that we never saw. We got to put them down, get them on paper, write them out, get the team together, get everybody contributing, put it down, make sure our game plan is right from the get-go. So once we actually start development, hopefully one day our bugs will be reduced. Everybody will live in nirvana. Great. So this brilliant slide that I put together, everybody loves the beauty of it, I imagine. We got to plan all this stuff. How long is everything going to take? We want to get our product, business wants to get their product out the door. The business does not want to wait for the product to be developed, customers are missed, customers are upset, this feature doesn't work, what the hell is going on?
And that's time. Thank you very much. Thank you for being such a great sport.
Oh my God.
It's fun, right?
That's the toughest talk I've done. That's the toughest talk I've done. Ever.
Stop that. How do I make it stop forever? Okay. Okay, our next speaker for round 2. Sorry. Drum roll. Drum roll. The next speaker is Cam Cruz. Where do I get this?
Second tab.
I have to find the other. Sorry, how do I get back to Slack? Oh. The arrow? This arrow? Okay. Here we go. Welcome, Cam.
Thanks, everybody. Today I will be talking about teamwork, which is really probably the most important thing when you're part of a team, is working together. And as most of you are professionals, you've all had to work with other people. So we're going to cover the top things about teamwork in the next 90 seconds. Generally, this is not an advisable work scenario where you have one person emoting to 3 different people. We want to be more conscientious in our communication style, so maybe do some more listening if you're the leader, and maybe try managing upward and getting your supervisor to be more communicative. That's what we're going to be kind of emphasizing here in our talk today. As you can see, many squares can fit inside one big square. Rubik's Cubes can also be a good part of teamwork. So maybe bring a Rubik's Cube next time you have a meeting. Cats are also really friendly critters, so maybe work with cats. Have a pet-friendly office. That can really facilitate teamwork. Generally, you don't want to finger point. People are going to mess up, as our last speaker mentioned. People are always going to introduce bugs into our code. And it's easy to point at them and make fun of them for introducing all these errors. But we'll try to be understanding. And this is really the most important part. We want to really critically review resumes before we enable somebody to become part of our team, because having non-contributing members of the team can really be destructive for the workforce. And I believe that is perhaps my final slide. Yes, it is. So,
thank you,
thank
Cam. And for our last and final Improv Talk speaker, drum roll please. Will Turner.
Okay, so this is me. Hi guys, I'm Will Turner, and we're talking about feedback in the form of post-it notes, especially if you guys can see there's a sort of yin-yang symbol in between the moon. It's often a helpful one. Venn diagrams, really a helpful form of feedback, a very innovative form if you haven't used it before. Can help locate you in the whole architecture of whatever's going on, and it's a visual reference we learned in about 2nd grade, so everyone has access to that. Music. I picked this up recently. I gave my boss, just responded to his email with a couple YouTube links to some 90s songs, and he wrote back what, but I think he more or less understood at a deeper level. Feedback takes a while to germinate, so you need to keep sort of keep at it. I know it can make you feel like your insides are like liquefying and your DNA is rearranging itself, and you're kind of so that's a painful process, but in the end, then you're flying. Yeah, I mean, I just threw that one in there because it seemed like a fun thing to do. So yeah, as I said before, post-it notes are good. Are good in general. These are all blank. Could use some more mystic, symbology on them. But generally, a good start. This is a good way to start an office space for your new recruits. Then they just know they have a bunch of squares to fill out. I don't know, are there any questions on this slide in particular? There are no questions here? That's good. Okay.
Thank you, Will. Thanks to all our participants for being good sports. It was super fun. And now, vote for the winner. Who liked talk 1, number 1? Okay. And who liked talk number 2? Who liked talk number 3? I'm going to say it was talk number 2. Congratulations, Cam. And now, break time, right? Have a break. Drink things, eat things.
So if anyone who's hiring wants to give a really quick pitch, come on up.
Hi, AngularNYC. I'm Alexandra, and I am the front-end engineering manager at Signifier. We are hiring for every level of Angular at this time, and a little bit of React and Node as well. So if you want to know more, we would love to talk to you. Me and Luciano are in the back, and we have business cards and LinkedIn profiles, the whole 9 yards. So come talk to us.
Anyone else hiring or is trying to find a job, wants to advertise? Raise your hand. No? All right, cool. So, up next.
Indeed, great. Hi everyone, thanks for coming to listen to this talk today. I'm the VP of Product at RubiconMD, so I'm going to be giving a very quick overview of our product and why we chose to upgrade from Angular 1. And with me today, I've got a couple of folks from our past and present development team to go into the actual talk. I'm just going to be opening up the opening act. All right, so I'll do a quick overview of RubiconMD first. So who here has seen a doctor in the last year? All right, so half the group about. And how many of you guys have seen a specialist as a part of that episode? And how was that experience? I just want to see like a tally, like 1 out of 10. Awesome. 2, 8, 9, 8, 2. Okay, so it's pretty mixed. You know, in the best case scenario, you see the specialist, have the right workup, they get you to where you need to go in terms of like the right medications and all that. But in reality, especially for folks who are more disadvantaged and underserved, they might be underinsured. You know, it takes them weeks, if not months, to get to the specialist. They may not have the proper workup. There are a lot of gaps in care in the system we have in America. And so what RubiconMD does is we provide a tool to allow primary care providers to have access to specialist insights. And so for what I mean by that is, you know, life for a primary care provider can be very difficult. They're seeing often 15 to 20 patients a day, just for a few minutes at a time. And so you come in, give your quick overview as to what you're experiencing, and sometimes they may not have the medical knowledge to be able to give you some more specialized information about that. And so we allow them to come onto RubiconMD, ask a simple question that's going to help them form a diagnosis, decide on the proper plan of care for their patient, or decide to refer to a specialist, and if so, what kind, with what type of workup before they get there. So that saves the patient a ton of time, and it oftentimes can provide some education for the primary care provider. So that's what we do. I was going to play a quick video. Is it worth it? Okay. So this is just a 1-minute video with a couple of thoughts from the primary care providers who have used our product. Is the link on here?
I have to go to Slack.
Oh, here it is. Okay.
Nice.
Accessible? Excellence. Awesome. Awesome. There is good quality that I feel like I can have, but there's certainly limits to what I know and what I can do. I mean, I'm not an endocrinologist. I'm not a OBGYN. I'm not, you know, I do internal medicine, pediatrics, and even within those fields, there are areas where I need some extra advice.
For example, I have a patient right now who's monitoring my blood cell count for quite a long time, and not finding any source for her infection, and thinking I need to send her to a hematologist, and sent a Rubicon consult in and got a great report back, and was able to manage her on my own, do the right lab work and follow up and get some reassurance. So it's really helped me do more comprehensive care for my patient.
So I explained the model to them, rather than have to spend 4 to 6 weeks to get into a psychiatrist in the Boulder area, we can actually consult with a board-certified 5-star psychiatrist and do that and have that information to us within potentially the same day. And then I let them down, so they're pretty impressed with that. But then I also let them know, oh, by the way, your cost for that is $0 versus your cost to see a psychiatrist in the Boulder area would be probably $300 per hour. So usually they're pretty happy. They kind of, well, what's the catch? Well, I'm like, it's just part of direct primary care. It's a value add.
It's a valuable clinical tool, but it's one of those huge value adds that I think our patients really appreciate.
I think they're really grateful. They feel reassured that not only are they getting my expertise, who knows them well, but also the backup from someone who has that specialty training and that more detailed knowledge of the subject.
One of the things that we're so used to doing is saying, I'm sorry to our patients. And this is just one way to say, you're welcome.
I do a lot of things that I think wow my patients, but I don't think there's many that wow patients more than Rubicon.
So hopefully that adds some nice color behind why e-consults can be so powerful for primary care providers. How do I get back to the slides?
You got the paper slides. No, those are mine.
Oh. We just won't do slides. That's okay.
You okay?
I can't go
I think
back.
it's the third tab.
Oh, the third?
Or no?
No.
That's not anything. Can you go back?
Nope.
Get the paper slides. No, that's my slides.
That's fine. We don't need slides. What I had on the next couple was just to show you that, the potential to make an impact here is huge. To do what's right for the provider, for the patient, for the whole system. But there are a lot of technological challenges. So the main 3 that we deal with, one can simply be connectivity. A lot of our providers are practicing in correctional facilities or in hospitals or in clinics that have thick walls for some reason, and it's just, that can be a challenge, even though it's hard to think of that. There are also hardware and software challenges. They're often on very old machines. They're on versions of IE that sometimes aren't even supported anymore. And so all of that has contributed to sometimes a pretty bad experience, including on our product. And relative to other products primary care providers use right now, like EHRs, those are also pretty terrible. So we aspire to be better than that. And as part of how we've done that, we decided to rewrite our front end, moving away from Angular 1. So that was the brunt of all the slides. It's okay, Brittany. What I was going to do is show you what things look like with Angular 1. Okay. I'm going to do a live demo. Is this because I'm on full screen? I can't click. No, yeah, I'm in browser stack. Oh, is it because of the browser? No, I was using this just prior. All right, that's cool. We'll just do it this way. Okay, so I'm going to log in. Angular 1. Watch for it. And bing, like 5 or 6 seconds into it in a best case scenario. But when you're dealing with older technologies and all of that, like it can take longer. This is where we were before we decided to embark on the front end rewrite. So that's all I wanted to kick off, just to start with like where we were. So I'll let you guys take it over.
All right. Hey, can you guys hear me in the back? Great. All right, so my name is Burke. I started at Rubicon MD in November of 2016, I believe. And so at that time, we had this great AngularJS client, which, you know, it had some troubles, as you can see, but it was serving our customers well. But it became clear that it was time to kind of rebuild from the ground up. You know, this client was built in a somewhat iterative fashion. You know, when you're a young startup, your business is changing, your needs are changing, you're trying to figure out what exactly works for you. And so things were built and then new features were added, and it was just kind of, things were getting added on more and more, but there wasn't really this cohesive big picture. And so that was one of the big motivations behind the front-end rewrite, was just trying to kind of start from the ground up and really see, now that we know what this product is going to be, how do we want to technically architect that? And then along with that, there were obviously a lot of limitations of AngularJS. You know, as you guys might know, AngularJS had reached the end of its life at that point, and Angular 2 was just starting to come out and be production ready. And so we decided that that was a good time. We jumped on it right when Angular 2 released. In fact, we did, I think, the very first version of the rewrite, where we started it. It was one of the release candidates of Angular 2, and we actually got burned a little bit because we decided to go with the Angular CLI, which is great, but they decided very late in the game to switch from System.js to Webpack. Threw a bit of a wrench in the works, so we ended up doing the rewrite about a month into the project. So that was great. But to dive a little bit more into the details, as I alluded to, Webpack was one of the biggest benefits of kind of starting from the ground up. And you know, we were previously using Grunt. The build system had been around for a couple of years. There wasn't a lot of modern technologies that you would expect. So no real bundling, which led to terrible lack of code reuse. As we mentioned, there's like the primary care provider facing version of the Rubicon MD client, and then there's also the specialist version. And so most of these interfaces that you can see here are pretty much exactly the same in terms of the UI that's presented, but there would be 2 totally separate versions of the code for all of these interfaces, and there's several other screens that were the exact same situation. So if you've ever dealt with this before, you find a bug in one place, you need to fix it in the other place, oh, you didn't quite fix it the same way, there's the subtle differences, became very painful to maintain, and so that was one of the big things we wanted, was just some kind of bundling system so that we could have some code reuse and keep ourselves sane when we're fixing bugs. Beyond that, other sort of modern building technologies, we wanted to, like I said, we wanted to have bundle splitting. There wasn't really much minification going on. To get a little bit more into the technical architecture, there was not really much in the way of even client-side caching when I started with this. So that was one of the big things that we really wanted to address, was making sure that we were taking better care of our users' network resources. You know, a lot of these primary care providers are in clinics that have very, very slow network connections. Some of them are in corrections facilities where they could have, you know, a 1 meg connection would be nice for them. And so, in addition to having a smaller build footprint, also just being much, much smarter about how we are storing resources on the client side, caching things, making sure that we're only really reloading data that we want. So this front-end rewrite was quite an adventure, especially as Angular 2, 3, 5, whatever, has evolved very, very rapidly. To talk a little bit more now about some of the specifics, I'm going to kick it over to my friend here.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to talk about why we decided to rewrite the app in Angular 2, 4, 5, 6, etc. And my name is Dave Miller. So about me, I started working, my first job in development was about 3.5 years ago. I started working with AngularJS in Scala, which was kind of a unique challenge for a starting developer. I honestly didn't love working in AngularJS. I had a really difficult time wrapping my head around it as a new developer. Left that job after about 9 months to pursue other options. Worked in mostly vanilla JavaScript, an HTML5 canvas.
Came right back.
What?
You came right back.
And then I came right back. About 2-3 months ago, I joined RubyconMD to work on their Angular platform, and now here I am, going to talk in front of all you. So bear with me. I'll try to do my best. Okay, so why did we upgrade to Angular 6? So one reason, the response times were too damn high. Better performance, because we need to load a lot of consoles. There's some difficulty in pagination because of HIPAA compliance. Easier to read code because the code base before was kind of a mess. TypeScript is a great thing. Straightforward architecture. Webpack is a beautiful thing, comes pre-configured. And then obviously the Angular CLI really helps you quickly prototype things. Okay, so performance. This was kind of what I imagined the situation was at Rubicon before we decided to do the rewrite. It says, you've had enough monkey see, Edwards, we want some monkey do. I imagine people had seen that the app looked good, everything functioned, but things were just basically too slow to be successful in a live environment. So we decided to tap into some performance features in Angular. And some of these we haven't implemented yet, but we have plans to. One of them is ahead of time compilation. The other is tree shaking. And the last one is lazy loading of modules. Okay, so ahead of time compilation basically means you compile ahead of time. So it's quicker because it usually has a smaller build time because the Angular compiler doesn't need to be added in. The Angular compiler is about 50% of the build. And then also, because you compile ahead of time, it actually renders quickly because it's built to render quickly. Also, there's inline HTML and CSS, so you don't need AJAX requests. And it also allows tree shaking. One caveat, the other way to do this is just-in-time compilation. And occasionally, if you have a really big project, just-in-time compiled builds can actually be smaller files, but they're still going to run slower, so it's kind of a trade-off. Okay, the other thing we did was tree shaking. Tree shaking reduces bundle sizes by looking through the dependency graph from top to bottom and trying to find which modules aren't actually being used, but are being imported into your files. This isn't perfect, tree shaking, but it's pretty good. You may say, like, well, what about code reviews to catch these things? Or what about, some linters will even be able to tell you. But in a fast-moving environment like our own, things get by, and this is a good fail-safe. The other thing we use is lazy loading. So right now, when you load our homepage, basically you only load the core homepage module, the nav bar, and the sidebar. Before, basically, you would load every single module. So say you want to create a new e-console. That whole module will be loaded into the file, which would slow down how fast the app would load even more. So it speeds up rendering time, which is a good thing. Okay, and then there's TypeScript. I think a lot of people, when they first saw TypeScript, were a little hesitant, a little reluctant to say this is a good thing to add types to JavaScript. I kind of liked it because I had worked with statically typed languages, and I think now more and more people are beginning to accept that this is a good thing. It'll catch errors at runtime or at compilation, and also if you have your editor configured, it will catch them even sooner. So say you have a function that takes a string and returns a number. If you try to pass that function a number, it's going to warn you right away that this is not right. That doesn't get into your code and pass and eventually lead to bugs down the line. And then also it's actually faster too because the JavaScript virtual machine is able to read static types, and at runtime, it's able to actually run it quicker because it knows exactly what it's getting. And also, I think it's more readable to be able to know what kind of type you're working with. Okay, the other thing is enforced separation of concerns. So this meme basically says separation of concerns. Don't let your plumbing code pollute your software. And there's like Drano, Clorox, whatever. There's like steaks, apples. Clearly you don't want these two things to mix. This is very similar in the Angular world, where you separate the TypeScript from the HTML from this SCSS. And I think, in my opinion, it's probably the best way to do it, and you really don't want to mix your HTML with your JSX and CSS, for instance, like React does. So the issue with React is, in a fast-paced environment like a startup, there is more room for error. There's more room to write really large files if you aren't careful. Angular has the view of separation of concerns, as I mentioned, of splitting these up into different files. I think this design forces you as a developer to keep things modularized. The other benefit of the Angular way is UX designers or other designers can work collaboratively with a JavaScript or TypeScript developer. So I work on the TypeScript part, and the UX designer could work on the HTML and the CSS in tandem. Whereas if in React, where you mix JSX and HTML, the designer is going to have trouble because maybe they haven't worked with JavaScript in their life, and you're basically you're able to focus on, you're able to get the best out of your team's skill sets by separating concerns. Okay, and then there's Angular standardized architecture. So, Angular standardized architecture is a good thing because, for one, it standardizes things, which is always a good thing. I know a lot of companies that obviously have linters, which enforce small rules like adding an extra line at the end of your file or having a space between the opening brace after a class. And this is kind of in the same vein. If you, as a developer, go work for his company, you've already seen a similar structure to the application, and it's going to be faster for you to onboard. I believe it's also a little bit simpler for junior developers to follow a repetitive pattern versus trying to focus on the architecture and the TypeScript and the HTML and the CSS all at once when all these things might be new to them. And then also I'm a big fan of dependency injection because it encourages decoupled components. Obviously it doesn't enforce decoupled components, but it at least encourages the pattern and makes it so Angular says this is the right way to do it. Okay, so again, why did we switch to Angular? For one, we think the code is easier to read, especially coming from poorly designed, poorly written code that we had with AngularJS. Consistent patterns, better performance, and of course, Webpack is amazing, and so is the Angular CLI. So the Webpack is a great, great tool. I've used it in projects outside of Angular. And basically it's a bundling tool to bundle all your different files, and so you could have a lot of different modules that are small, whereas before you would have had to write a gigantic JavaScript file. And then the Angular CLI is great because you could just, in one command, do like ng-generate component, Dave's component, and it will create the TypeScript file, the SCSS file, and the HTML file, and then also load that stuff into the app.module.ts file. And it really reduces a lot of boilerplate that you would have to write in the first place. So basically, just use this command, ng-generate component, better healthcare, and you're on your way to making a competing startup. And
Do you actually type out generate when you do that?
what? No, you do. I do G, but it's clear. But yeah, that's it.
So we have two questions. Do you have a question?
Yes.
Oh.
Can I ask first? Yes. I couldn't sit So you mentioned that you use dependency injection and you rely on this pattern. What if you need to have your reusable component? How do you achieve it?
If you need a reusable component?
Yeah, how do you solve the problem of reusability of the components using dependency injection?
How do I reuse a component that's used elsewhere in multiple places?
Right.
Let me jump in.
Yeah, you jump on that.
I feel like a lot of the reusability of the component is about designing in such a way that it's dependent only on its inputs, right? To provide some of a counterpoint, I think that the big benefit of the dependency injection, at least in the Rubicon MD Angular client, is actually at the service level. And so I mentioned before about how we have this provider side, the specialist side. So the vast majority of the functionality between the two is the same. You know, the shape of the data that they're loading is mostly the same, but some of the functionality somewhat varies. And so something that we were able to do is have basically a base service class that knows how to perform most of this functionality, and then inherit from those service classes at the module level, and then use the module level service overrides. And then with Angular's nice integration with TypeScript, you just require that particular type of service and get a nice generic component consuming it that doesn't even necessarily know what it's actually, what the actual specifics of what it's using.
Thanks.
I had a question. So when you were talking about upgrading to the new version, I thought you mentioned HIPAA compliance and pagination. Could you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. New here and not a back-end developer, but I believe the reason is about querying our database. It's obviously encrypted, and I think to actually access the data, you need, I think you need the exact first name, you need the exact last name, and you might need like a social security, which makes like you can't just get the next 10 in the list. You need like an exact key to grab this row of the database, if that makes any sense. Do we have back-end people?
You got a thumbs up from the back.
I got a thumbs up. That was my guess.
All right, thank you.
One more.
One here, yeah.
Oh, yes.
When you were looking at going from 1 to 2 as we went to, I guess, did you look at NG upgraded all as an option, or did you just decide right from the get-go to be a rewrite?
That's for him.
Wholesale. I didn't personally find that there was anything redeeming about the existing code base that was worth reusing. When I first started, all of the API calls were in one service. There was no caching in the service at all, even like within memory, like that you would expect from like a single page app. Most of it, like I said, also like the templates, the components, the controllers, there was 2 or 3 versions of pretty much all of them with like lots of different disparate code. And also, I forgot to mention, it's also all written in CoffeeScript, which I do not like. There's a controversial opinion apparently, but I felt personally like it was the best decision to just kind of start again from square one, really think about where we wanted it to be in the long term, how we could best take advantage of all the features of Angular. And
yeah, I couldn't find a really old video of what the interface used to look like, but you would log in, it would take up to 20 seconds to load everything, and various things would flicker, and you saw the counter took several seconds, and it just looked bad. I didn't have to spend very long to be like, where's all this tech that, like, how can we really needed to upgrade the experience, and you could tell just all over the stack there was a lot of debt we'd accrued by building really quickly to get all the features we wanted, but it wasn't allowing us to scale in a very sort of stable, high-quality way for our customers.
Yeah, and you would never want your app to be that slow, but for us, like primary care doctors are typically seeing 20 patients a day, and they have like a few minutes per patient, and they always have a bunch of people sitting in the waiting room. So their ability to be just there waiting for stuff to load was really penalizing for them. They lost patients really quickly, so it was important that it was really responsive.
Thank you.
And up next we have Nehal giving a lightning talk on PWAs in Angular using service worker.
the start presentation. But okay, we'll get started. So, hi everyone, my name is Nehal. Probably have seen me walking around. I help out Alex with this meetup. Progressive web app. So, first of all, I didn't know what was progressive web app, so I looked up on Google what is progressive web app. And a paper comes up, or Wikipedia article comes up that tells me that it was a paper written in 2015 by 2 Google guys, which means progressive web app is a new thing. So in short word, what it is they said that in today's time with the technology we have, a web application should behave like a native application on the phones. That means when you open it, it should behave natively responsive way. So what does that mean? I'll show a demo. So I turned off my Wi-Fi and my phone network, and I'll try to access Angular.io. So basically that's what I get. Like, it doesn't open. But I saved it as a PWA on my phone here, and if I open it, it says I don't have cellular data and da-da-da, but the application opens just like a regular app. But it's not Angular.io app, it's just Angular.io website we're all familiar with. So probably will open a page too. So without any network, it's still behaving, which is pretty neat. So the point of PW is like you want to make your app like that too. So if the user saves it like that and it behaves natively, even though there's no network or anything, at least the startup screen should come up. And they introduced this PWA thing in Angular 5 and upwards. So it's pretty new, and I just thought I'm not sure if people know about it. So actually, I shouldn't. Let's just go to the next slide. So it's pretty much I said what it does. So service worker, what it does is it caches your application stuff. So some of the stuff it caches is your index.html, basically the startup file. The fav icon is the icon you provide. It will show up on your phone if you store it as an application, both Android or iOS or any other version. Build artifacts are some of the JS and CSS initial files, and then any other assets, basically in the assets folder, whatever pictures you have, it will cache them. So that means every time a user loads the application, it won't pull down everything from server again. It will only just load up from cache, which saves both data and time. The process is basically update happens. So the first time the user opens, of course, it will pull down everything from the beginning. But second time onward, it will just look in the background for updates. And if it sees any update, it will just update those things. So it basically doing a little service worker stuff behind the scenes. The benefits, as I demoed in the beginning, your web application will behave like native application. And the other one is saving bandwidth and resources, like I said in the beginning. The only one downfall is service worker is supported in Chrome and Firefox. So if you're using IE, I don't know about Edge, so those two might not allow you to save it as PWA. So now we're going to straight jump into how it works. So thanks to Angular 6, they made a CLI command to do all this work. So one command will do the magic for you. So it's actually more to talk about than actually implement service worker. So I created a very plain application with CLI, ng-new, and AngularNYC service worker. So I'm going to run the command from here. And the project name would be whatever you named it. So if you see on top, mine is AngularNYC SW, so it has to be the exact name. That's big enough.
What was the command anyway?
It's in the slide. It's I'll show you again. So it's ng add. Okay, I'll open the slide. It's ng add Angular PWA -- project and your project name. If you run it at the source level, probably it's done setup. So when it runs that command, it does few things. First of all, in index.html, it puts in few stuff. It adds a manifest. It adds your theme. That adds the icon, basically, the fev icon, and adds two files, basically, manifest.json and ng serviceworker.json. So it's somewhere here. Now these two files, this file tells you, basically this is the configuration file for service worker. You tell it how it should fetch the files. So as you can see, here's lazy and prefetch. Lazy is basically, you're gonna tell service worker which files to pull. It won't pull it automatically. Prefetch, service worker will do the pulling work. It will just automatically check for update and pull the new files. So there are the only two modes available. And this, as you can see, straightforward what you're trying to pull from service worker, what you want to cache on the server side. If you go to manifest, there are more configuration like the name, short name, all these assets and icon stuff that you want to cache. So that is the setup part. So I'm going to go back to the slide if it opens. Let's see if it opens here. OK. So it's exactly what I just said. It's just in 4 or 5 lines, so I'm not going to go over them to save time. Now the testing part, how do we test that service worker is working? So because I already implemented a service worker, I'm going to run it the regular way, and let's see if it does the service worker job. So by regular way, I mean I'm going to run the npm install, npm start. All right, so if I go here, localhost 4200. So as you can see, this took like 351 milliseconds, but there's no service worker work involved, because whenever service worker works, you'll see something called NGSW. So how do we do the testing part is I put down the commands in the slide also. So first, you pull down, you do a build for it. So as this is building, it will create a disk file, as you all know. And once you have the disk file, in the meantime, I'm going to copy this command. So this npmi server, HTTP server, allows you to just run a mock server to run your deployed, run your build. So npm install HTTP server. Oh, OK, I know where. So sometimes copy paste doesn't work. All right, I installed it. I went to my dist. And then the next one is just running the version on port 8080. So if I open now localhost, before that, I'll open the. So it's saying it's fetching, but it's missing out on stuff. So I don't know, sometimes. So I don't know what's this missing, but I have a backup. So I'm going to go to my backup project. My demo is failing, so I guess it's not working here. So the point of this demo was when you run this, it will basically pull down and it will show you this is service worker. So when you actually basically run this like offline and you refresh the application, it should basically load it. So the point is, let me see if this one works, because I know this is implemented. Is it because my Wi-Fi is not working? Let me see. But it's not hitting the website also, so okay, this open. So what I'm trying to say is this should work, so. And if I hit it offline, so what I wanted to say was you see all this ng worker happening, right? And now I clicked offline. Basically, that means I have no internet connection. If I refresh this page, the application should still load. And it's still like loading in like 2.99 seconds. If I didn't have service worker, and if I try to load something, so Google has service worker, so I have to find a random website that doesn't have it, let's say. Oh, because I know. So let me turn off Wi-Fi. So this says it doesn't have connection, but this should load. So that's the point of service worker. So even though you don't have connection, your application will still load, and it will load because it's cached. And that means each time you do initial load, you will save on the bandwidth of the user. Let's say your initial load was 1.6 or 2 MB. If people who don't have that much data plan, like they have 1 GB data plan, 2 MB is a lot for them. So each time they're loading the application, you're saving them 2 MB of data. Also, you're getting much faster load time because it's not coming from the server, it's just loading straight from cache. Because my demos are not working, I'll just head straight to the service worker guide and tell you guys how you can configure and do some other stuff. So if you go to angular.io, which I have in the next slide, if you come here to techniques and then service workers, production, well, we did production, configuration. So they give you some very simple stuff like the 2 modes I talked about. You also get stuff like straight go to the page. Oh, this is it. So I'm trying to find a point where it, oh yeah, communication with service worker. So you can easily import SDW update, and basically whenever there's a new version available, if the user loads an old version and there's a new version available, you can do a pop-up saying, hey, there's a new version available, reload the page. If you don't want to do that, if you want to force it by yourself, you can check like for updates, and when the updates are available, you can force the reload by yourself. And that's another configuration they provide you. Also, this configuration is basically you tell service worker which files to pull in. So like some of the things like Rubicon was talking before, that they had needed to implement lazy load and pull in components on demand. Implementing on top of service worker would be caching those components and probably just reload them with if there's some static stuff on the component, we'll just store it. And on top of it, you pull in the new data and you just put it in. So that will also save on the bandwidth of pulling the component each time via lazy loading. So those are some very good benefits of service worker. And as you can see, only one command can set it up in your application. So might as well not do it. Why not do it and make it into a progressive web app? So users can also store it on their phone and they can load it whenever they want. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And sorry about the demo, it didn't work. I don't know why. Probably I'll create a GitHub project and drop it. Oh yeah, questions? Yes?
Is there any help given through PWA to help you manage state offline? So like if you were to like save something and then...
That would go back to the first talk, like managing state. If you want to have Ngrx, if you have Ngrx, you might want to use local storage. But if you don't have Ngrx, you manually have to use local storage to do that. So that would be one way of doing it. Any other? Yes?
NG6, along with the new schemas, this is a nice little feature that I've provided. I guess everything you have assumes you're not accessing any of the native features, though, right?
Yeah, it has nothing to do with the native features.
And like he said, are there configurations? How much do you cache? I haven't looked at it yet.
Yes, yes. So if you go here in their configuration, you can actually precisely tell what you want to store in. Basically, it will go in the manifest. So if you come here, manifest, you can precisely tell which files you want to store and you don't want to store. And also, you can change the settings to make it lazy instead of prefetch. So you actually tell service worker which files to pull in for update rather than it.
If you didn't have it lazy in your application, it'll make it lazy?
No, it will make it prefetch, and it will look for the ones you haven't mentioned. But if you mention and you make it lazy, then it will, like, basically you're telling service worker, hey, look for this file and look for if this is updated or not. So that's the difference.
Is it running as a separate thread in the browser?
Yes, I haven't looked at it actually, but it's running behind this in the background, so I'm pretty sure it's a separate thread. Because it doesn't interfere with your regular work. And one thing about finding the new update, so once you build and if you have changes, the first time you deploy, and if the user opens the website, they won't see the change. What will happen is service worker will make the call behind the scenes to see, oh, there's a new version available. It will pull down the whole version, and then if you have that configuration to pop up something, tell the user reload, they reload, they'll see the new one, or else they'll see it the next time they open the page.
And it has to do with the browser too, right? So Chrome used to be thread-driven, now it's process-driven.
So it will be Chrome and Firefox, yeah.
Thread, but I think Firefox is still process-driven. So that service worker should still be a separate process.
Yeah.
Not a thread.
Okay. And I don't know if it makes any sense, but only one service worker per application, or is it
Yeah.
possible to spawn a second service worker?
I mean, what would be the necessity of having, yeah. So it's like, it's the service worker is pulling in basically doing one job. So currently they have only one service worker.
You're writing a multi-threaded application, there's plenty of reasons why you want
Yeah.
threads.
But JavaScript runs on one thread, so.
Yeah, so basically from now on, running Angular, it's cheap, in 30 seconds you have a PWA.
Yeah.
Just might as well do it.
Yeah, that's why I'm like, you're just doing npm install, might as well run the next command, the other one, so make it part of, yeah.
Last question. You did mention that it had advantages for mobile devices that might not have great network resources.
Yeah, like I was saying, like I don't have any network, but you can open the app.
Understood. But let's say a majority of users are using desktop, laptop environments, do you still see benefits using those type of environments?
Yeah. If you don't have internet access, or sometimes what I used to have with my previous ISP is like my Wi-Fi is connected, but actually there's no feed of data. So.
What about just page loads in itself, just having some of the pages cached?
You're saying the auto caching by the browser that it does? Well, it's not guaranteed. Like, I mean, I don't know how actually the browser caching works, but this actually guarantees the files you're telling to cache will be cached. So It's more of like a guarantee versus you're taking a shot at the browser or putting faith on the browser.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Cool. Thanks for coming, and please join us at Westville after this. I think it's right across the street. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, RubyCon.